The auctioneer's chant was a rhythmic, hypnotic drone, a sound as familiar to me as the clatter of my own John Deere's diesel engine on a cold spring morning. It was late October 1973. The air had that sharp, clean bite of coming winter, and the low afternoon sun cast long shadows across the muddy implement yard of Miller & Sons auction service. Men in seed corn caps and insulated Carhartt jackets stood in tight knots, their breath fogging in the chill, their eyes scanning the rows of machinery like predators sizing up a herd. I wasn't there to buy. Not really. I was there to watch, to gauge the mood of the county. And the mood was electric, feverish. Corn was over $3 a bushel, soybeans were pushing $7. Land prices were climbing so fast you'd get a nosebleed just thinking about it. The bank men were everywhere, their shoes too clean for the mud, their smiles too wide. They were handing out money like it was candy at a parade, encouraging every farmer to expand, to modernize, to leverage their assets. My neighbor, Richard Abernathy, was holding court near a brand-new cherry-red International Harvester 1066, its paint so glossy you could see the worried clouds reflected in its hood. He'd just bought it, of course, probably signed the papers right there on the fender with a loan officer's pen. He was a big man, Abernathy, with a booming laugh and a gut that strained the buttons of his flannel shirt. He believed in progress, which to him meant the biggest, the newest, and the most expensive. "You see that, Silas?" he bellowed, spotting me lingering by a rusty old hay rake. He gestured with a thick hand toward the 1066. "That's 125 horsepower of pure American muscle. Puts your old two-popper to shame." He was talking about my 1968 John Deere 4020, the tractor my father and I had bought new, paying cash, after 3 straight years of bumper crops. It was the last major piece of equipment we'd bought before he passed. It had 1,000,000 hours on it, but I knew every bolt, every grease zerk, every whine and groan of its 6-cylinder engine. It didn't owe me a dime. I just nodded at Abernathy. "She's a nice-looking machine, Dick." "Nice-looking. She'll plow 100 acres before you can get that old Deere of yours started on a frosty morning," he laughed, and the men around him chuckled along. They all saw me as a relic, a stubborn fool farming the same 320 acres my grandfather broke with a team of mules, refusing to take on debt, content to patch and weld my old iron while they were all getting rich. The auctioneer moved on, past the gleaming new stuff, to the back row, the junk row, the place where worn-out, broken-down dreams went to die. And that's where I saw it. It was a monster, an articulated 4-wheel drive, sitting low on 4 massive bald tires, its frame bent in the middle like a tired old man. Its paint, once a proud shade of industrial green, was faded to a chalky mint and blistered with rust. The windows of its cab were cracked and yellowed. A thick, greasy stain ran down the side of the engine block from a blown head gasket, a wound that had bled its lifeblood into the dirt years ago. It was a Steiger Bearcat, one of the early ones, built in a barn up in Minnesota before the company got big. A pioneer of a machine, now left for dead. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Hank Miller, barely gave it a glance. "All right, boys, what we got here is a big old Steiger for the scrap man. Engines seized up tight, hydraulics are shot. Good for parts or maybe a mailbox post. What'll you give me for scrap iron? Let's start it at $500. Who'll give 500? Silence. The only sound was the wind whistling through the grill of a nearby combine. Scrap prices were down. Nobody wanted to haul this beast home. Abernathy guffawed. 500? Hank, you'd have to pay me 500 to drag that pile of rust off your lot. More laughter. I just stood there, looking at it. I saw past the rust and the broken parts. I saw the massive planetary axles, the heavy-duty frame, the sheer raw potential of it. That tractor was built when steel was cheap and engineers weren't afraid of overbuilding something. It had good bones. 400, Hank tried again, his voice losing its rhythm. Come on, boys, the tires are worth that. I stepped forward, my worn work boots squelching in the mud. The crowd parted a little, surprised. I'll give you 300, I said, my voice quiet but clear. Hank's head snapped in my direction. He almost looked relieved. 300 from Silas. I got 300. Who'll give 350? 350. The silence was deafening. Abernathy was staring at me, his mouth hanging open in disbelief before it twisted into a smirk. He shook his head as if to say, "There goes the village idiot." "Sold," Hank's gavel cracked like a rifle shot, "for $300 to Silas Miller. Son, you just bought yourself one heavy boat anchor." The walk to the auctioneer's trailer to pay my bill was a long one. I could feel their eyes on my back, hear their whispers. What's he going to do with that thing? Lost his damn mind. Guess he can't afford a real tractor. Abernathy caught up to me, clapping a heavy hand on my shoulder that was meant to be friendly but felt like a ton of bricks. "Silas, my boy, what in God's name are you thinking? That thing's scrap. You'll spend $5,000 trying to fix it, and you'll still have a 30-year-old piece of junk." I handed my $300, all cash, to the clerk and took my receipt. I looked Abernathy square in the eye. "Maybe so, Dick, but when I'm done, it'll be mine. Paid for. Can you say the same about that new 1066? His smile vanished. His face got hard. He had just signed a note for $30,000, and we both knew it. He didn't say another word, just turned and walked back toward his shiny new tractor, the one the bank really owned. Getting that Steiger home was a job in itself. I had to hire a heavy-haul trucker with a lowboy trailer. We winched it on, the steel cable groaning in protest, the old tractor scraping and screeching like a dying animal. When we finally got it unloaded in my yard, it looked even worse than it had at the auction. It sagged in the middle, listing to one side, a monument to failure. My wife, Sarah, came out of the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the tractor, then at me, and didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The question was plain in her eyes. Why? Now, before I tell you about the night spent in the shop, the grease under my fingernails that wouldn't come out for a month, and the sound of that big diesel finally roaring back to life, I've got to ask you folks watching this a question. Have you ever taken on a project that everyone, and I mean everyone, told you was a fool's errand? A car, a machine, a piece of land that looked like a lost cause? Let me know down in the comments what it was, and tell me if you ever got the satisfaction of proving them all wrong. Because that's what I was banking on. The satisfaction. And a paid-for tractor. The first order of business was getting it into the machine shed. The shed my father and I built with our own hands, with poles cut from our own woods. I hooked my 4020 to it with a heavy chain, the John Deere's engine barking as it took the strain. The Steiger's wheels were frozen, and it was like trying to drag a mountain through the mud. I had to use every ounce of the 4020's power, the rear tires digging deep trenches in the yard, just to move it an inch at a time. It took me the better part of an afternoon to drag it the 100 feet into the relative warmth of the shop. Once inside, under the bare light bulbs hanging from the rafters, I could finally take a true measure of the beast. It was powered by a Caterpillar 3306. A six-cylinder diesel known for being tough as nails, but this one was in a sorry state. I pulled the dipstick. It came out coated in a thick, milky sludge. Water in the oil. A cracked head, a blown gasket. Or worse, a cracked block. The radiator was shot, its fins corroded and crumbling. The hydraulic lines were a spiderweb of cracked, brittle rubber weeping a slow black ooze onto the concrete floor. For the next 3 months, that machine shed was my world. I'd finish my chores, eat a quick supper with Sarah, and then head out to the shop, often working until past midnight. The first job was the engine. I drained the foul-smelling oil and water mixture, then started the long, tedious process of disassembly. Every bolt was a battle. Rusted solid, I soaked them in penetrating oil, heated them with an acetylene torch until they glowed cherry red, and then leaned on a 4-foot breaker bar with all my weight, praying I wouldn't snap the head off. The air filled with the sharp smells of rust, burnt oil and sweat. I pulled the head with a chain hoist. Just as I suspected, the gasket was blown to pieces between cylinders 4 and 5. But the bigger problem was the cylinder walls. They were scored and pitted with rust from the water that had sat in them for years. The engine didn't just need a new gasket, it needed a complete overhaul. I pulled the pistons, tagged every part, and laid them out on my workbench in perfect order. I took the block, the crank, and the head to an old-timer named Gus, who ran a machine shop in the next town over. Gus was a master, a man who could measure tolerances down to a 10,000th of an inch by feel. He looked over the parts, chewing on an unlit cigar. "Gonna cost you, Silas," he grunted. "Gotta bore the block 30 over, turn the crank, new pistons, rings, bearings, valve job on the head. You're looking at a couple $1,000s in parts and machine work. $2,000. It was a staggering sum for me. That was my seed money for next spring, but I'd started this, and I was going to finish it. "Do it, Gus," I said. While Gus worked his magic on the engine components, I turned my attention to the rest of the tractor. The hydraulics. I must have replaced 100 feet of hydraulic hose, each one custom cut and fitted. I rebuilt the main pump on my workbench, carefully replacing every seal and O-ring, working from a worn, grease-stained service manual I'd managed to find through a dealer in North Dakota. I took apart the steering cylinders, honed the insides, and installed new packing. It was slow, frustrating work. More than once, I threw a wrench across the shop in anger, the clang of steel on concrete echoing in the cold night air. The talk at the co-op hadn't died down. If anything, it got worse. Abernathy would make a point of asking me, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Hey Silas, how's that scrap heap of yours coming along? You get it to run yet?" He'd always get a good laugh. I learned to just ignore him, to keep my head down and my mouth shut. My hands, stained black with grease, did my talking for me. My only ally was Sarah. She never complained about the late nights or the money I was pouring into that green monster. She'd bring a hot thermos of coffee out to the shop for me around 10 o'clock every night. Her presence a quiet reassurance that I wasn't completely crazy. Finally, the day came when Gus called. The engine was ready. I drove my old Ford F-250 into town and loaded the freshly machined parts. The engine block was a beautiful, clean grey, the cylinder bores honed to a perfect crosshatch. The crankshaft gleamed. For the next week, I meticulously reassembled the engine, torquing every bolt to spec, checking every clearance with a plastigauge. It was like surgery. Finally, with the help of the chain hoist, I lowered the massive Caterpillar engine back into the Steiger's frame. I bolted on the transmission, connected the drive shafts, the fuel lines, the radiator hoses. The moment of truth arrived on a cold Saturday in late February. I filled the radiator with fresh antifreeze and the crankcase with 30 quarts of new Dello 400 oil. I bled the fuel system until clean diesel dripped from the injector lines. I hooked up 2 massive truck batteries. I took a deep breath, climbed into the cracked seat of the cab, and turned the key. The starter groaned, turning the big engine over slowly, painfully. 1 revolution, 2. It sounded tired, unwilling. Then a puff of white smoke coughed from the exhaust stack. Then another. The engine caught on 1 cylinder, then 2. It sputtered and shook, rattling the whole cab. I gave it a little throttle, and with a deafening roar, the Caterpillar 3306 exploded into life. Thick black smoke poured from the stack, filling the machine shed, but it was the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. It ran. It actually ran. I let out a whoop of pure joy, the sound swallowed by the thunder of the engine. After sitting dead for 5 years in a fence row, the heart of the beast was beating again. The arrival of the 1970s farm boom was like a slow rising tide that eventually lifted all boats. It didn't happen overnight. It started in '72 with the Russian grain deal, a massive sale that sent wheat and corn prices into the stratosphere. Suddenly, the grain we were growing was worth twice what it had been a year before. The feeling in the air changed from cautious optimism to outright gold rush fever. Farmers who had been struggling for years were suddenly flush with cash, or at least flush with borrowing power. For Richard Abernathy, it was vindication. He was the prophet of this new age of agricultural prosperity. His gamble on debt and expansion was paying off in spades. That new 1066 he'd bought at the auction was just the beginning. In '74, he traded it for a brand new 1466, a turbocharged monster with a cushy air-conditioned cab. He bought the 160 acres to the west of his place, then the 240 acres to the south. His operation swelled from 500 acres to nearly 1,000. He did it all with the bank's money. Every time land came up for sale, he was the first in line at the Farm Credit Office, using his rising equity as collateral for the next loan. He bought a new Gleaner L2 combine for $60,000, a machine so wide it took up the whole road. He built massive grain bins to store his crop, hoping to play the market for even higher prices. He tore down his old farmhouse and built a new brick ranch-style house with a two-car garage for his wife's new Lincoln Continental. Abernathy was no longer just a farmer, he was an agribusinessman, a land baron. When he drove past my place in his new Ford pickup, he'd slow down and shake his head at the sight of me. There I was, still on my old 4020, pulling my 6-row planter. Or, for the heavy work, I was in the cab of my resurrected Steiger. I had finally gotten it field-ready. I'd found a set of used but decent tires for it, sandblasted the whole machine, and gave it a fresh coat of industrial green paint. It wasn't pretty, but it was a powerhouse. With the rebuilt cat engine, it could pull my 24-foot chisel plow through our heavy clay soil without even breaking a sweat. It allowed me to get my full tillage done in half the time, saving precious fuel and man-hours. But to Abernathy and the others, it was still just Silas's folly. They saw a man clinging to the past while the future was being written in loan agreements and equipment leases. "Silas, you're sitting on a gold mine and you're too stubborn to dig," Abernathy told me one afternoon at the co-op. He was leaning against a pallet of seed corn, looking prosperous and confident. "Your 320 acres are paid for. The bank would loan you $250,000 against it tomorrow. You could buy that Henderson place next to you, get yourself a new planter, a real tractor. You're farming like it's 1955. "My farm feeds my family and it doesn't owe the bank a penny, Dick," I said calmly. "That's good enough for me." "Good enough?" he scoffed. "Good enough is for losers. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You're letting it pass you by." The pressure wasn't just from him, it was everywhere. The farm magazines were filled with articles about expansion and high-yield technologies. The equipment dealers called me every week, trying to get me to trade in my old iron. Even the banker, a young man named Peterson with a slick haircut and a polyester suit, paid me a visit. He sat at our kitchen table, sipping Sarah's coffee, and laid out a portfolio of loan options. "Silas, with land at $1,000 an acre and climbing, your net worth is fantastic. We could set you up with a line of credit that would allow you to double your acreage. We see you as a prime customer, a man with a solid foundation. It's time to build on that foundation." I listened politely, and when he was done, I pushed the papers back across the table. "Mr. Peterson," I said, "my father taught me 2 things. Never buy land you can't pay for in 10 years, and never buy a machine you can't pay for in 3. The way I see it, these high prices and low interest rates can't last forever. What happens when they change?" He smiled a condescending smile. "That's old-fashioned thinking, Silas. This is the new economy. The world needs our grain. The experts all agree the boom is here to stay." I didn't argue, I just thanked him for his time and showed him the door. But his visit left a seed of doubt, not in me, but in Sarah. Later that night, as we were getting ready for bed, she turned to me, her face etched with worry. "Are they right, Silas?" she asked quietly. "Are we making a mistake? The Abernathys have a new house, a new car. All we have is more work. Maybe we should have listened." I took her hands in mine. They were rough from gardening and housework, but they were the strongest hands I knew. "Sarah, all of that new stuff Abernathy has, it's not really his. It belongs to the bank. Everything we have, this house, this land, that old green tractor out in the shed, it's ours. No one can take it from us. When this whole thing goes south, and trust me, it will, we'll still be standing. That's a promise. I was using the profits from the good years, but not for expansion. I put a new roof on the barn. I replaced the fence lines. I put $20,000 into a savings account at the bank, a cash reserve that earned a paltry 5% interest but gave me a profound sense of security. And I kept my equipment in perfect running order. I did a complete in-frame overhaul on the 4020's engine, not because it needed it yet, but because I knew a day was coming when I wouldn't be able to afford to. That day was coming sooner than anyone thought. By the late 70s, the first cracks were appearing. Inflation, which had been the farmer's friend by pushing up land and commodity prices, was now a raging monster. The price of everything was going up. Fuel, fertilizer, parts, groceries. A hydraulic filter that cost me $10 in 1973 now cost $30. And to fight that inflation, a new man had been appointed to run the Federal Reserve, a stern cigar-chomping man named Paul Volcker. I read about him in the Wall Street Journal, which I picked up at the drugstore every week. He had a radical idea. To break the back of inflation, he was going to jack up interest rates to unheard-of levels. One evening in the fall of 1979, I was standing at my fence line, looking across the valley. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Across the way, I could see the yard lights at Abernathy's place click on, illuminating a vast empire of steel. His new combine, his fleet of tractors, his rows of grain bins. It was an impressive sight, a testament to ambition and modern agriculture. But as I stood there, a cold wind blew across my fields, and I didn't feel envy. I felt a deep, unsettling chill. All of it, every single piece of it, was tied to a number at the bank. A number that was about to change. The party was almost over, and the bill was coming due. The year 1980 began not with a bang, but with the quiet closing of a door. President Carter announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. Just like that, our biggest customer was gone. The price of corn at the local elevator, which had been hovering near $3, fell to $2.50, then $2.20. At the same time, the number I'd been watching in the Wall Street Journal, the prime interest rate, began its terrifying climb. 10%, 12, 15. It was like watching a flood gauge in a hurricane. The first sign of real trouble for Richard Abernathy came that spring. I was cultivating my corn with the 4020, the old tractor purring along contentedly, when I saw his big International 1466 sitting dead in the middle of his field, a thin wisp of blue smoke curling from its exhaust stack. He was a quarter mile from the road, and I could see him pacing around it, kicking at the massive rear tires. I finished my row, drove across the ditch, and idled up to his fence line. "Engine trouble, Dick?" I called out. He looked over, his face flushed with anger and frustration. "Damn thing just quit," he yelled back, making a hell of a noise, then locked up tighter than a drum. "Spun a bearing. I'd bet my last dollar." A spun bearing in a DT436 engine wasn't a simple fix. It meant a full teardown, a new crankshaft, a complete overhaul. It was a $10,000 repair, easy. "Got a warranty?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "Ran out 500 hours ago," he spat, throwing his cap on the ground. "The dealer wants 12 grand to do a rebuild. 12 grand, and they can't even get to it for 3 weeks. I've got 600 acres of corn to cultivate." He stood there, a man who owned $1 million worth of land and machinery, completely paralyzed by a single broken part. His new, complex tractor was a black box to him. He could drive it, but he couldn't fix it. He had to call a specialist, a man in a clean uniform driving a service truck that charged $90 an hour from the moment it left the dealership. I didn't say anything. I just put my 4020 in gear and drove back to my own field. An hour later, I came back, pulling my own field cultivator. I unhooked it at the edge of his field. "It's not as wide as yours," I said, "but it'll get the job done while you're waiting on the dealer." Abernathy just stared at me, then at my old, faded green cultivator. He looked like a man who had been offered a rowboat after his yacht sank. But he was out of options. "I appreciate it, Silas," he mumbled, not quite meeting my eye. For the rest of the week, he used my equipment, a constant rattling reminder of the value of simplicity. As the months wore on, the cracks in his empire began to show. The price of diesel fuel nearly doubled. Fertilizer prices went through the roof. The interest on his operating loan, which had been a manageable 8% when he signed the papers, had been adjusted upward with the prime rate. It was now 17%. He was paying thousands of dollars a month just in interest, a river of money flowing from his farm to the bank, and he wasn't paying down a single penny of the principal. He started cutting corners. He didn't replace the worn-out disc blades on his big offset disc. He tried to get another year out of a set of tires that were worn down to the cords. One afternoon, I saw him out in his shop, a torch in his hand, trying to weld a crack in the frame of his Gleaner Combine's corn head. The weld was ugly, a thick, lumpy bead that looked more like a caterpillar than a proper repair. He didn't have the touch. He had forgotten how to make do, how to fix things with his own 2 hands. He had come to rely on the checkbook and the dealer's service truck, and now, with his cash flow choked to a trickle, both were failing him. My own farm felt the squeeze too. The price I got for my corn and beans was barely enough to cover my costs. But my costs were a fraction of Abernathy's. My biggest expense was fuel for the Steiger and the 4020. I had no loan payments, no equipment leases. When a hydraulic cylinder on my chisel plow started leaking, I didn't call a mechanic. I drove to town, bought a $5 seal kit, and rebuilt it myself on my workbench in 2 hours. The $20,000 I had saved sat in the bank, a silent bulwark against the storm. It wasn't making me rich, but it was letting me sleep at night. The breaking point for Abernathy came during the harvest of 1981. It was a wet, miserable fall. The fields were saturated, the ground turned to a thick, greasy mud that could swallow a machine whole. His big, heavy Gleaner L2 combine, the pride of his fleet, was a nightmare in those conditions. It was too heavy, its two-wheel drive system useless in the muck. He was constantly getting it stuck, spending more time hooking up chains than he did cutting corn. I saw him one evening, near dusk. He was buried to the axles, the combine listing badly to one side. His new four-wheel drive pickup was hooked to it, spinning its tires uselessly, digging itself deeper into the mud. He was covered in mud from head to toe, his face a mask of despair. The confidence, the booming laughter, it was all gone. In its place was a hollow, haunted look. I rumbled out to the field in the Steiger. Its 4 massive tires, each one nearly as tall as I was, churned through the mud with an unstoppable force. The old tractor didn't even seem to notice the mire. It was built for this, for raw, brute force pulling. I hooked a long, thick chain to the combine's rear axle, eased the clutch out, and felt the Caterpillar engine dig in. The exhaust stack belched a column of black smoke as the turbo spooled up, and with a deep guttural groan, the Steiger pulled the $60,000 combine from the mud like a dentist pulling a bad tooth. I didn't wait for thanks. I just unhooked the chain and drove back to my own work, leaving Abernathy standing alone in his muddy field, staring at the machine that was supposed to have been his salvation, now just another anchor dragging him down. The tide was going out, and he was stranded a long, long way from shore. By 1982, the crisis had a name: the farm debt crisis. It was on the nightly news, stories of families losing farms that had been in their blood for 100 years. The interest rate hit 21%. Land that had been appraised at $2,000 an acre in the late 70s was now selling for $800 if you could find a buyer at all. The math no longer worked. There was no way to raise a crop that could pay back the money that had been borrowed against that inflated land value. The bankers, the same smiling men in clean shoes who had pushed the loans so eagerly, were now cold-eyed repo men. Their letters, once filled with cheerful greetings and loan offers, now contained harsh, legalistic terms like foreclosure, liquidation, and notice of default. The community was gripped by a quiet terror. Every farm auction was no longer a sign of a neighbor retiring, but a sign of a neighbor failing. The crowds were different now. They were somber, quiet. They came to watch a man's life be dismantled, piece by piece, under the merciless chant of the auctioneer. They were there to pick over the bones, but also out of a morbid fear that their own farm could be next. Richard Abernathy held on longer than most. He sold off his breeding cows. He sold a small parcel of land he'd inherited, using the cash to appease the bank for a few more months. His wife's Lincoln Continental disappeared, replaced by a rusty Ford Fairmont. But it was like trying to bail out the ocean with a teaspoon. His debt was too massive, a giant that demanded to be fed, and his income had withered to nothing. The notice for his auction appeared in the county paper in the spring of 1983. It was a full-page ad, a stark inventory of a broken dream. By order of the Farm Credit Bank, the assets of Abernathy Farms will be sold at public auction. There it was, in black and white, the International 1466, the Gleaner L2 combine, the fleet of wagons, the massive disc, the 24-row planter, and the land. 800 acres to be sold in 5 separate parcels. The day of the auction was cold and grey, a fitting sky for a funeral. The yard where Abernathy had once proudly displayed his new machines was now a muddy, chaotic mess, his life's work tagged with lot numbers. I saw him standing near the porch of his new brick house, which was also for sale. He looked 10 years older, his face was pale, his shoulders slumped. He wasn't talking to anyone, he just stared out at the crowd, at the bargain hunters and the neighbors who had come to watch his fall. His wife was nowhere to be seen. I wasn't there to buy. I was there to bear witness, to see the end of an era. The auctioneer, the same Hank Miller who had sold me the Steiger 10 years earlier, started with the small items. Tools, feed bunks, fuel tanks, they went for pennies on the dollar. Then came the big machinery. The 1466, the tractor he'd bought to replace the one he'd mocked me for not buying, sold for less than what he still owed on it. The Gleaner combine, his $60,000 jewel, brought $18,000. Every crack of the gavel was a hammer blow to the man I saw standing on the porch. While this was happening, I was surviving. My life hadn't changed much. I still drove the same pickup truck. I still farmed the same 320 acres. But in the context of the ruin around me, my stability felt like incredible wealth. My corn yields weren't spectacular, but I didn't have a banker taking the first $3 from every bushel. My machinery wasn't new, but it was mine. The Steiger, that old pile of scrap iron, had become the symbol of my survival. It was ugly and loud and uncomfortable, but it was invincible. It asked for nothing but fuel and grease, and it would pull the earth apart for me. I had less than Abernathy, but I owed nothing. In the new economy of the farm crisis, that made me one of the richest men in the county. Finally, Hank Miller moved on to the land. The crowd grew quiet, the tension palpable. This was the real heart of it. The land was everything. He started with the parcel farthest from the home place. It sold cheap to an out-of-state insurance company. The next parcel sold to a speculator from the city. Abernathy didn't even flinch. It was like he was already gone, a ghost watching his own dismemberment. Then Hank announced the last parcel to be sold that day. Lot number 3, 160 acres, prime bottom ground, located directly adjacent to the Silas Miller farm. It was the Henderson place, the very piece of land Abernathy had told me I was a fool for not buying 10 years ago. A low murmur went through the crowd. People looked from the auctioneer's block to me. My heart started pounding. I hadn't come to buy land. I had no ambitions of building an empire. But this was different. This was the land that bordered my own. It was a buffer, a shield. And a thought, cold and clear, entered my mind. If one of those insurance companies bought it, they wouldn't care for it. They'd rent it to the lowest bidder, who would mine the soil, let the fences fall, and spray chemicals that would drift onto my property. Hank started the bidding. "What'll you give me, boys? Let's start at $700 an acre." An opening bid came from a man in a suit I recognized as an agent for an investment firm. "700, he said, his voice clipped and confident. "710, another voice called out. The bidding went back and forth, climbing slowly. 750, 770. It was all happening so fast. I looked over at Abernathy. He was watching me, his eyes pleading, though for what, I wasn't sure. Maybe for me to not participate in his humiliation, or maybe for me to save this one piece of his legacy from the corporate vultures. The investment agent bid $800 an acre. The other bidder dropped out. Hank Miller scanned the crowd. "I've got $800 an acre. Do I hear 810? 810? He looked right at me. Going once, going twice. I thought of the $20,000 in my savings account. I thought of my father's words about never buying land you couldn't pay for. But this was different. This wasn't about greed. It was about preservation. 810, I said. My voice was a croak, but it cut through the silence. The agent in the suit looked back at me, annoyed. He conferred with a partner, then raised his hand. 820. 830, I said, my voice stronger this time. We went back and forth. 840. 850. We were approaching the limit of what I could afford, even with a small loan against my own paid-for land. The agent bid $900 an acre. $144,000. It was a fortune. My stomach was in knots. I took a deep breath. $910, I said, putting everything I had on the line. The agent glared at me. He shook his head and turned away. He was done. Hank Miller's eyes lit up. 910 is the bid, sold, for $910 an acre to Silas Miller. The gavel cracked. A wave of murmurs rolled through the crowd. I had just doubled the size of my farm. I felt dizzy, sick to my stomach. I looked over at Abernathy. A single tear was tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. He gave me a slow, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and walked into the house, closing the door on the wreckage of his life. The weeks after the auction were a blur of bank meetings and paperwork. I had to take out a mortgage for the first time in my life, but it was a manageable one, secured by the full weight of my existing debt-free farm. The banker, a new man who had replaced the slick young Peterson, treated me with a deference that bordered on reverence. I was a survivor, a relic from a bygone era of fiscal sanity. The first thing I did after the deed was filed was walk the fence line between my old property and the new. It was the same fence I had stood at years ago, watching Abernathy's empire rise. Now it was all mine. The land was in rough shape. The soil was compacted, the ditches were filled with silt, and weeds choked the edges of the fields. Abernathy, in his desperate final years, had taken from the land without giving back. It would take years of careful stewardship to bring it back to health. A few days later, I saw a battered pickup truck pull into what was left of Abernathy's driveway. He had managed to keep his original 160 acres and the old farmhouse his grandfather had built, the brick ranch house having been sold to a doctor from town. He was unloading some old, worn-out equipment he'd managed to buy for cheap. A rusty Alice Chalmers tractor that looked to be 30 years old and a 4-row planter. He was starting over, from scratch. I drove my 4020 over, pulling a flat rack wagon. On it was the cultivator he had borrowed from me years ago. I pulled up to his shop and he came out, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. He looked tired, but the haunted look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet resignation. "Thought you might be able to use this," I said, nodding toward the cultivator. "No sense in it just sitting in my shed." He looked at the cultivator, then at me. He swallowed hard. "Silas, about the auction, You don't have to say anything, Dick." I cut him off gently. It was a bad time for everyone. I paused, then I took a leap. "Listen, that new piece of ground I bought, it's more than I can really handle on my own right now. I was wondering if you'd be interested in renting it from me. Crop share, 60-40. You do the work, I'll provide the land and the fertilizer. We'll build that soil back up together." He stared at me, his mouth agape. I was offering him a lifeline, a way to farm the very land he had lost, a way to regain a piece of his dignity. He was a proud man, and I expected him to refuse. But the farm crisis had humbled everyone. "Why would you do that, Silas?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "After all the times I gave you hell, called you an old fool." I looked out over the fields, at the rich black dirt that had claimed both of our lives. "Because this land needs a good farmer, Dick. And you're a good farmer. You just listened to the wrong people." "Besides," I added, a small smile touching my lips, "my old Steiger is getting bored just farming 320 acres. It needs a challenge." He didn't say anything for a long time. He just nodded, and for the second time I saw tears well up in his eyes. This time, though, they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of gratitude. We farmed that way for the next 15 years, side by side. We never became close friends, not really. There was too much history between us. But a deep, unspoken respect grew. He taught me things about new hybrid seeds, and I taught him how to rebuild a hydraulic pump. We were two sides of the same coin, the gambler and the grinder, and we had both, in our own ways, survived. My son, David, grew up during those years. He spent his summers riding in the cab of the 4020, and later the Steiger. He learned to drive them before he could legally drive a car. He had my hands, always tinkering, always fixing. He never knew the fever of the 70s or the terror of the 80s. To him, the farm was simply a place of stability, of hard work and predictable rhythms. One afternoon, when he was about 16, we were in the shop, changing the oil on the Steiger. It was faded now, the paint I'd put on it years ago peeling in spots, but the big cat engine fired up on the first turn every time. "Dad," he asked, tightening the drain plug, "why have we never bought a new tractor?" All my friends, their dads have new ones, with computers and GPS and air conditioning that actually works. I wiped my hands on a rag and leaned against one of the giant tires. I looked at the old green monster, my $300 boat anchor. "David," I said, I want you to understand something. It's not about what something costs when you buy it. It's about what it costs you to own it. Every new tractor on those dealer lots comes with a passenger, a banker, sitting right there in the cab with you. Every time you turn the key, you can hear his voice, whispering about payments. This old girl, I patted the steel frame, she doesn't have a passenger. She's all ours. She doesn't owe us a dime, and we don't owe anyone for her. That's a different kind of freedom. It's a kind of wealth they don't teach you about in school. He was quiet for a moment, thinking. He looked from the tractor to me, and I saw in his eyes that he understood. He understood the legacy wasn't just in the land, but in the wisdom of how to keep it. I'm an old man now. My hands are gnarled with arthritis, and my steps are slow. David runs the farm, all 480 acres of it. He's a good farmer, better than I ever was. Cautious but smart. He bought a new planter a few years back, but he paid cash for it, using money he'd saved for 5 years. The old John Deere 4020 is still here, used mostly for light-duty work, a semi-retired old hand. And the Steiger still sits in the main shed. David doesn't use it much anymore. Newer tractors are more efficient. But he'll never sell it. It's a monument, a reminder. Sometimes, on a quiet summer evening, I'll walk out to the machine shed and just stand there, looking at it. I can still smell the faint scent of new paint and old diesel. I can still feel the thrill of that engine roaring to life for the first time. Everyone saw a pile of scrap, a fool's errand. But I saw good bones. I saw potential. I saw a way to stay free. That tractor didn't just pull a plow, it pulled my family through the darkest time in modern agriculture. It was the anchor that held when the storm hit. And it stands there today, a silent green giant, a testament to the simple, stubborn truth that sometimes the surest path to wealth is to refuse to go into debt to find it.